Good morning from Washington, or good afternoon if you're overseas. My name is Benjamin Mossberg, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Africa Center here at the Atlantic Council. It's an honor to be with you all here today. The Atlantic Council is thrilled to co-host this discussion today. Allow me a special thank you to our partner, the Policy Center for the New South, under Executive President Karim El Ainawi's leadership. The Policy Center is Morocco's premier think tank, which aims to contribute to the improvement of economic and social public policies that challenge Morocco and the rest of Africa as integral parts of the global economy. Thank you very much for including us as a partner in such an important discussion, and for all of your contributions and insights into our work over the years. You help us better support policies that ensure that Africa is an integral part of the Global South. Following a decade-long partnership, the Policy Center for the New South and the Atlantic Council have joined their forces around a new project focused on the power of the Atlantic. This series of publications and events will focus both on opportunities, such as sustainable energy and minerals development, as well as challenges, such as our next policy brief and webinar on piracy in the Gulf of Guinea, and others around the Atlantic Basin. But why the focus on the Atlantic? The Atlantic Basin plays a key role in the core missions of both of our organizations, dedicated towards promoting transatlantic relationships since their founding. Every year, the Policy Center for the New South hosts its flagship event, the Atlantic Dialogues, which takes place in Rabat, Morocco in December, and releases its annual report, The Atlantic Currents, while the key Atlantic Council programs from the Transatlantic Security Initiative to the Transatlantic Climate and Energy Security Project contribute to shaping transatlantic policies. Today's program takes place against a backdrop that includes a continued focus on the Atlantic for both of our organizations. Recent events have analyzed economic trends on both sides of the Atlantic. We've looked into issues surrounding sustainable energy and minerals development opportunities, and separately, patterns in migration flows. Upcoming written commentary will look into frontline issues including maritime piracy, artificial intelligence, and security issues affecting the African Atlantic Basin. Turning to today's program, we'll take the opportunity to hear from Bill Brown, Senior Fellow at the Global Energy Center here at the Atlantic Council, and Sabrine Emran, an international economist at the Policy Center for the New South. Senior Fellow Bill Brown has devoted his extensive career to leadership on the environment, on energy, biodiversity, and support for Indigenous culture and roles in government, the private sector, and academia. Welcome, Bill. Sabrine Erman has worked at the Policy Center for the New South since 2022 and brings with her an extensive background as an economist where she currently works on commodities and energy markets. Welcome, Sabine. Before we get to our two experts, kicking off today's event is Ambassador Agnes van der Meulen, French career diplomat, currently serving as Deputy Chief of Mission at the Embassy of France in Washington, D.C. Prior to this role, she served as Ambassador of France to Malta, as well as spokesperson at the French Foreign Ministry. Her areas of expertise include, among others, public communication, international law, and European affairs. Before turning to Bill and Sabrine, welcome, and over to you, Ambassador.
Merci beaucoup. Good morning, Ambassador. Bonjour, Romain. Good morning, Benjamin. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to speak to many audiences, in fact, at least in the US and in Morocco. So good morning, friends of the ocean. First, let me congratulate the Atlantic Council, Africa Center, and our Moroccan friends at the Policy Center for the New South on the publication of this very interesting policy brief, which builds on the momentum created by the third United Nations Ocean Conference, called UNOC 3 for experts, taking place this week in Nice, organized, as you probably all know, by the UN, but jointly hosted by France and Costa Rica. It's the largest ever international conference devoted exclusively towards oceans. What makes it unique isn't just the very large number of nations represented, about 160 that are taking parts at high levels, but also the diversity of the participants. Political decision makers, scientists, association heads, philanthropists, development banks, corporate leaders from the maritime and energy industry, that will be also key, as you mentioned, participants in the Women for Sea meetings, and indigenous people living in harmony with the ocean. And we probably all have to learn more from them how to reconciliate development, life, and the ocean. In Nice, the nations of the world will adopt the Nice Ocean Action Plan. This plan consists of a political declaration already negotiated in New York over a period of several months, along with voluntary commitments by stakeholders to preserve the ocean and maintain its sustainability. With regard to the priorities that France will be promoting at UNOC 3, let me just mention the ones that reflect those included in the William Yancey Brown's excellent report. First, and it's almost a done deal, the first is the entry into force of the agreement on the conservation and sustainable use of marine biological diversity of areas beyond national jurisdiction, or BBNG. These areas represent 64% of the ocean. They are a common space whose sustainable management is of crucial importance to the planet's future. And as President Macron stated very proudly yesterday, we're about, in fact, to reach the 60 ratification that makes it possible to envisage this entry into force by the end of the year. Second, the decarbonization of maritime shipping. Several extremely innovative French companies are involved in these efforts by exploiting wind power, for example. Freight transport services of this type already exist between France and the United States. Third, championing and supporting scientific research. Such research is fundamental to achieving a better understanding of the ocean, building a protective framework that's on a part with challenges we are facing, and making informed decisions. And fourth, mobilizing new financing to build a sustainable blue economy that extend to energy production so that people don't have to choose between environment and development. This goal was one of the main topics at the Blue Economy and Finance Forum held in Monaco just last weekend. With regard to energy, France intends to take full advantage of the potential offered by the ocean while ensuring its protection. The third multi-annual energy program currently under discussion in France set our energy goal, for the coming decade. It includes an 18 GW target for offshore wind power by 2035, enabling it to produce more than 10% of our decarbonized electricity. I also want to remind you of the French position on deep sea mining, a subject that William discusses in his policy brief. There has been a ban on seabed mining in French waters since 2022. France has the world's second largest maritime territory after the United States and wants to lead by example, and hopefully will be followed at some point. In international waters, France champions a moratorium on all types of exploitation. 32 countries have already come out in favor of this. We need to give scientists enough time to improve our understanding of still largely unknown deep sea ecosystems and enable the International Seabed Authority to adopt an environmentally robust mining code. This position is further validated by the scientific proclamation published on March 31st during the SOS Ocean event held in Paris. It's based on the conclusions of an 18-member international commission that studied opinions from 40 deep seabedded experts from 28 countries. Lastly, a word about the United States. It's still and remain a great maritime nation, and its contributions to our understanding of the ocean, the fight against illegal fishing, and the sustainable development of the blue economy are vitally important to all of us, including to the US. And we hope that the US will also join us at some point on some of those actions, even beyond the conference. So once again, thank you so much for giving me, and by me, I mean France, the opportunity to take part in your discussions. And I'm still very certain that it will be very productive. So we will also learn from you. Thank you all and have a great discussion. I should maybe pass over the floor to, it was Sabine, if I'm not mistaken.
Exactly. Thank you very much, Ambassador. Thank you very much, colleagues from the Atlantic Council. Thank you, Ambassador Rama. And really thank you for the opportunity for representing the Policy Center for the New South in this virtual event. We are very proud of our partnership with the Atlantic Council, especially discussing topics of utmost importance, such as harnessing the power of the Atlantic. I believe that this event and discussion today could not have come at a timelier moment. We are meeting on the premises of the World Ocean Day, just as the world prepares for the only third UN Ocean Conference, a reminder that the ocean still remains a largely unknown territory for much of the global community. The numbers speak for themselves in the way we need to see how the Atlantic is important for the African continent. 46% of the continent's population, 55% of Africa's GDP, and 57% of all its trade is connected directly to these waters, the Atlantic ones. So this means that the Atlantic is not only Africa's gateway to the world, it's the economic backbone of the continent. For centuries, these waters have carried African resources to global markets, brought in essential goods, and connected our communities to opportunities that are beyond our shores and our borders. But however, yet as we look at the future, we are still standing at a fascinating crossroad. Why? Because the same ocean that has sustained African economies for centuries through trade and fishing now presents us with new, entirely different possibilities and opportunities. So I would like to highlight a little bit what was mentioned by Her Royal Highness Princess Lala Hasna in conveying the delivery of His Majesty King Mohammed VI's message to the Africa for the Ocean Summit, where he mentioned that we must move from a potential-based logic to one of ownership. This is where it comes for the Africa's maritime destiny. The royal message reminds us also that Africa's seas and oceans are not just rich, but also vulnerable, and not only strategic, but also underexploited. They represent untapped potential that requires a fundamental shift in how we look and approach our blue economy potential. So this perspectives aligns perfectly with our event today and the moments that we find ourselves in, as countries around the continent are actually grappling with energy security challenges and the world accelerates its transition towards renewable energy sources. The Atlantic is emerging not as a highway for commerce, but also as a powerhouse for clean energy generation and production. This is where the King's call for blue growth through offshore renewable energies combined with the Atlantic African States Initiative underscores a crucial point, the one where Africa's Atlantic seaboard, long neglected despite its infinite potential and possibilities, must become a platform for strategic dialogue and economic integration. In terms of energy, we're not just talking about adding new sources of energy to the mix, but we're also exploring whether the ocean has already shaped Africa's destiny and can write the next chapter of our energy independence while ensuring that this time Africa captures a more equitable share of the world's ocean wealth through coordinated action and shared prosperity. To discuss these topics and more, and to understand the energy landscape that the Atlantic Ocean has laying ahead of us, I'm happy to be moderating a discussion with Bill Brown, non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. So Bill, thank you very much for being here with us today. And before having Bill share with us generously his insights about the topic, about the importance of the marine energy and harnessing the power of the Atlantic, I'd like to invite our audience to ask us their questions on Ask. And Bill, I'd like to start with you now, and to ask you first, what kind of energy landscape do we have in the ocean, particularly when we are mentioning the Atlantic? The floor is yours, Bill.
Well, there's sort of two aspects, but fundamentally, everybody should remember that that the ocean as a whole covers 70% of the world, and the Atlantic about 20%, and it has a long-standing, now controversial, important source of fossil fuels in the neighborhood of 30% of oil and close to 30% of gas, and a strong emerging offshore wind function, with China actually growing the fastest now, but a lot of Atlantic proposals into work on the western side of the Atlantic, and then a lot of new things. I'll mention them briefly, passing on. So this is just a big part of the world that we need to take care of, but we need to make sure that we make use of it as we can. And Sabrina, just one other thing to note, I saw the word landscape, or hear the word landscape, and that's actually been a very big issue for the siting of offshore wind turbines off the Atlantic coast of the United States, and particularly in tourism, but also some of the ones I've been most concerned about, indigenous impacts on tribes, like the Aquinnah tribe of Martha's Vineyard and the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe there too. The Aquinnah regard the sea view, they call it seascape rather than landscape, as part of their culture in an important way, really a religion. And so we need to be sensitive about that.
Thank you very much, Bill. It's interesting how you mentioned also the role of indigenous people in this landscape, but that was also mentioned by Ambassador earlier. I'd like now to move a little bit into discussing your paper, Marine Energy Harnessing the Power of the Atlantic, where you argue that African nations should not be told to develop their offshore oil and gas resources while wealthy nations continue production. I think this places African people at the heart of having a choice to make, especially as the world is evolving in a very different pathway, and that we have the pressure of climate change. So while we have the urgency of having actions to be made, given the urgency of the climate action, how do you think we can reconcile between the fairness of this argument, but also global carbon budgets that are constrained at this level also?
Well, I mean, Sabrina, I think it's more than an excellent question. It's a really kind of burning, in some ways almost unresolvable issue. On one hand, there is the climate crisis, and as many have pointed out, if you just look at a carbon budget, how much carbon we're putting in the air, plans for development that lead to carbon emissions are such now that there's no way, if we just go forward that way, we're going to stay within even the 2 degrees centigrade objective that's been set forth internationally. We're already at 1.5. I think people are kidding themselves if they don't think we're there. So that's real. But the other point which you mentioned is wealthy nations are still producing oil and gas from the ocean and from land-based sources too. And it's really an ultimate act of sort of hubris to ask less wealthy nations not to try to benefit from that. So I declined to make a recommendation in this paper on whether oil and gas should go forward or not. But my recommendations presume it will, as it is now in place, and to try to find a way to make sure that there's benefit to that, to the people of Africa, which we're focused on here. And some of that will depend on, I think, transparency and how money is used, and make sure that it goes to the people as much as possible. And another thing is something I've called a pan-Atlantic blue ring. I haven't seen anybody use the term blue ring. It would be a blue ring to protect us all rather than a ring to rule us all. I think it would be I think it'd be helpful, and it sort of fits the ambassador from France's point about the biodiversity beyond national jurisdictions, for the nations that have Atlantic coasts to think about how to move forward on that, knowing that everybody has different laws and programs and so forth. But you know, there are other examples where organizations like World Wildlife Fund and Nature Conservancy have pushed things that are more regional or global, knowing that there are different laws, but still people can cooperate and use the laws they have.
It's very interesting that you mentioned the Pan-Atlantic Blue Ring, because we have received a direct question on the chat mentioning that. And the question says that given the need for countries to cooperate on Pan-Atlantic basin issues, can you give us a little bit of highlights on how Pan-Atlantic Blue Ring could actually and concretely become a reality? Just a few elements to tap on that before digging into carbon mechanisms also.
Yeah, well, as the ambassador from France mentioned, there is a new multilateral convention, biodiversity beyond national jurisdictions, that's has been adopted and is moving towards ratification. Unfortunately, the United States is not likely to be part of it for now. But it certainly provides in its text mechanisms to work together on a project that would be a pan-Atlantic, a blue ring. But that's actually not even necessarily required, because there are institutions like the World Wildlife Fund that are the IUCN that's present in every country, you know, to move that as well. So I see it as a mix of government interest and NGO interest that could make it work. And we're talking. What I'm thinking of is it's partly land, like wetlands and little islands right offshore, and it's partly marine reserves. And many of these nations already have something. They already have people working in agencies of different kinds. France certainly has that. The United States has that. Morocco has that. So there's a good opportunity to just focus on those things and try to move forward.
So, Bill, I'm going to go back to another question that came on the live chat, and it's more oriented toward carbon questions, and I will complete it with a question that I have myself. So we'll have two parts. So the first part is, as the U.S. looks to increase the drilling of oil and gas, why should African countries seek to move away from carbon-based fuel resources in favor of renewables? So my question maybe has part of the answer, and it's really, in your opinion, should there be a differentiated carbon price and mechanisms that can be beneficial for African development while penalizing continued extraction by wealthy nations? And how would this look like?
Yeah, maybe I'll start with the second part, which I do recommend that. I think having a social cost of carbon to be taken into account in any kind of regulatory activity is a good idea, and it's a good idea no matter how rich or poor a nation is, because even for a poor nation, it has to decide whether some kind of policies that affect business, regulatory policies, are beneficial or not beneficial. And one of the costs is harm, and the harm. There's been some work. Some have sometimes defined the cost to be international. You know, one country emits, let's say, a country emits greenhouse gases, and so the cost of carbon could be the impact on the world. But it's sometimes been presented as the impact on the country itself, which is smaller. And I think it's kind of impossible to argue against the idea that a country should take into account the impact on itself. Broader question on what to do globally, and I wouldn't tweak that with. I mean, that's really economics. It's basic economics. It's kind of like science, if you believe economics is science, to figure out what the social cost of carbon is. I would answer the question about cost more that, indeed, I think there's a good argument that the less wealthy nations, including in Africa, should somehow get a break on having to pay for this. And I'm not sure whether direct concessionary funding or other things is appropriate. But I wouldn't mess around with what I'll call the economic science of the social cost of carbon. And then on the first question, absolutely. Well, I have been employed by the federal government in different jobs, both political and non-political. But I hope that the United States government will change its position in due course, and be more sensitive and supportive of climate. I mean, we've gone back and forth. That's obvious to anybody who reads the news. So I would hope that I would hope that's not a continuing issue. But indeed, I mean, it is. How can any nations that are actively pursuing fossil fuel development tell less wealthy nations they shouldn't do it? I find that very hard from the perspective of justice, of fairness.
Absolutely. And this also brings us to the question of the life cycle and the time horizon. That is a very tricky element also that can be related to these carbon mechanisms prices as well. So while we discuss energy projects, not only in Africa, but anywhere else in the world, we are talking about projects that have a lifespan of 25, 30 years. And while we emphasize the urgency of acting for the climate within this decade, within the next few years, how do we reconcile between these timeline mismatches? Because we cannot have both at the same time. We cannot pose really an urgent action with some deadlines that are coming in the next years.
That's a good question. I mean, obviously, an investment for a larger time frame is if it's fossil fuels, is worse because there's a commitment to generate them. But I think the best answer I can think of, which I built into the report, is to focus on the development of renewable energy from the sea and on land, and including nuclear, especially the smaller modular nuclear facilities, which in some ways are renewable themselves, because the term really generally means you're not going to run out of it, and the fuel for these facilities, even fission, is not going to run out anytime that we need to immediately worry about. So I think that's the best thing to do. In a way, I'd say it's to focus on the positive, on developing renewable energy, and so change the demand. And if the demand changes, if those renewable sources become much cheaper, as they have in some cases, then the fossil investments will probably shift. The companies that are involved in that will find a way to shift it. Maybe they won't even last as long.
I really like the focus on the positive, and with that, I will move to one of our recommendations that are really positive and give us an optimistic view on the future, although I'm going to try to challenge it a little bit because that's actually my job. So you recommend the call for venture capital investment in waves, currents, and OTEC technologies that has struggled for decades to achieve commercial viability also. So given that Africa has limited capital, wouldn't resources better be directed toward proven technologies such as offshore wind and solar? And before giving you the floor to answer, could you please highlight a little bit for our audience who don't know that, what is OTEC? Can you give us a glimpse of what tidal technologies are, just very quickly before answering your question? Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Sabrina. Some of these, there's a group of energy technologies that I've called nascent. In other words, they're there, but they're not really much developed. And some of them are pretty obvious, like waves and these standing currents. Like there's a huge current that involves the Gulf Stream in the Atlantic. The Gulf Stream going north, it's warm water. It hits Greenland around there, and it gets colder and sinks and comes back down, deeper down in a cold form. So it circulates, and so waves and then currents like that are understandable, I think, offhand. I did note this thing called OETC that Sabrina notes. No one will know what it is probably, except experts. But it's ocean energy thermal conversion. The concept, though, is not that complicated. It can work in the tropics. It is limited to where the water at the surface of the sea is a lot hotter than the water down below at the same location, really cold. You can use that temperature difference to generate energy. Let's keep it as that. Everybody doesn't have to know how the devices work. Some of those devices can desalinate too, if it's an open system of that. And there is huge energy potential for the use of OETC. And it's been around for a while, though, and it hasn't and it hasn't really developed other than through pilot projects. It's hard to know why exactly, but the ocean is a hard place to put those devices, I guess. And so the answer to your more kind of policy question, though, Sabrine, I think is most investment should go into things that are probably more certain, like solar and offshore wind. But I think it really makes sense. It does in science, certainly, like cancer research, to make sure that a fair amount of your funding goes into high risk projects, they call it. Things that are not likely you don't really think are going to pan out, probably, or a good chance they won't. Because you never know when that one thing will suddenly become what matters the most. And that was the case actually for our RNA that came out as a vaccination value. For a long time, it wasn't funded by our own NIH, and it came back. Same thing's true of energy. So my thought is that venture capitalists who do that kind of thing, that's part of their Silicon Valley, MO. They fund things that are likely to fail, and then they find something that won't. And so it would be a modest amount of the total investment, I would be sure, but I think it would be good for those investors to take a hard look at these nascent sources of energy.
And I think, Bill, and you might agree with me, that one of the key challenges when it comes to nascent but also quite developed renewable energy sources in the African continent for their deployment is one, finance, second, technology. And I would like to focus a little bit on the technological readiness gap in the African countries. How can we make sure that venture capital financing does not face the value of death? And I might join that to a question that we have received in the chat, and that is regarding actually how you mentioned AI in your recommendations in your paper, and if you can give us a word regarding that while giving us an answer to this question.
Yeah, well, so obviously I think everybody on this call knows that part of what's needed is just stability in governance for investments. And companies are, they're unless they believe that a government system is going to be relatively stable and expectations about funding and so forth are transparent, that's a big holdup. But I do think one of the things that will make a huge difference is the proper treatment of artificial intelligence. I put this into the report, even though I know it's not focused on energy and minerals. It's a much larger issue, but it's right on us now. And as I think most people here know, the leading big companies are just very focused on developing what they call agents, AI agents that do things like most human beings can do, or at least that's what they're working on, AGI. And I believe that does offer a great opportunity for, when you put it in the first instance, maybe education, in Africa and in places that have had a hard time accessing intelligence, actually, from educators of some kind. And so my thinking on that, I did put a couple of recommendations in on AI. It's that the companies that have all this money now, they're all getting very rich, right? Or very few companies. Wealth is, I would say, with AI, unless something changes, wealth is heading to the most rich, just like it always seems to have in the past. And those companies should make these tools, the best tools that are being developed, available to everybody in the world, but certainly Africa, and every kid in Africa that doesn't have a dime should be able to access them. And then the tools should be involved in local discussions about how to deal with energy and minerals. One of the big issues is that there's a real likelihood of very significant job loss from these agents because they can do a lot of things that people don't need to do. The only thing they can't do very well so far is actually move things, but they have robots in the works now too. So I'm not new in suggesting this is a very big concern, but I think some of the tech companies have not highlighted it because it goes against their model. There's a company named Anthropic, and Dario Amodei, who's the CEO of it, has made a point. He saw it in the United States that in a year or two, we might have 20% unemployment in the United States because of the loss of entry level white collar jobs. So Sabrina, it'd be crazy to say, well, we know what's going to happen. Some people think that AI is going to take over the world and so forth, but I think it's really important to make sure that everybody, and especially kids in Africa, have those tools, and people engaged in meetings on things like mineral resources and energy, which involve jobs. People are approving documents and things like that. That they're intimately involved in the development of this, in the use of the system as it develops.
Absolutely. I totally agree with you, Bill. I would have loved to go into all your recommendations and discuss them one by one, but I wanted to pick a few ones. And there is one that really resonates with the work I do and is very relevant for African countries. And it's the one where you oppose deep seabed mining due to environmental certainties. Yet, as we know, terrestrial mining in places such as the DRC, where 70% of the world's cobalt reserves are concentrated, involves unsafe conditions and child labor, to say the least. So according to you, how do we, and mostly realistically, secure the critical minerals needed for the renewable energy transition, not only in the African continent, but most specifically in the case that we are discussing today?
No, that's a really good question. And actually, let me build a little bit on what the ambassador from France was telling us, and that is one study says we don't know 90% of the species of animals that live in the deep sea. There was at least one study to that effect. And several other studies suggest that around half of the animals that live in the deep sea bed are actually attached to these rocks. So if we remove them now, what we'll do will be very destructive. And so what I did in the paper, and actually I hope everybody takes note on this, I noted the moratorium that the government of France supports. But I tried to go beyond that and actually look at the environmental standards that are in play. Some that have been adopted, some for exploitation not yet adopted, but might be. And I think it's clear if you look at it from the perspective of a scientist and an environmental regulator that those standards wouldn't be met now. Now, science might help us get there. AI might get it there too. And that's an area for the past 10 years until a year ago. For 10 years, I was the environmental regulator, the senior environmental official for the seabed mining and use of the United States continental shelf, which is big, 3.2 billion acres. So I do have a feeling from my own experience about that, and I think it's just such a jump. In terms of how to actually, but we do need those. We do need critical minerals.
Absolutely.
And we need rare earths. I would say so. I think for now, focus on research for the sea. Focus on improving mining that goes on land. And obviously, there's a big problem with what's going on in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And there are others on this call that know the details of that much more than I. But I think the answer is try to make it better. It is, I mean, if you step back and think about it, it's just a lot easier in general to manage environmental harm on land than it is 2 or 3 miles down at the bottom of the ocean, where even to do any work there is extremely hard. We do know at least technically how to minimize the impacts of mining on land. And then many of these, there are 17 rare earths. The U.S. lists 50 critical minerals. Most countries have its own list, but they differ. So I think those that need them need to take a hard look, be clear about which ones are really the most important. Try to support the development of industries. I'll shift a little here. China produces most rare earth elements. And the majority of mining there too, but rare earths are not really that rare. They're all over the world. They're not very concentrated except in a few places. But with the right kind of investment, the U.S., other wealthy nations could way strengthen the production of those things. So we need to do that, focused on what we need. Now for cobalt, very important, but another issue I think to note is there's already a movement to try to find batteries that don't rely on cobalt, and there's some that work and are quite as powerful, but we shouldn't assume that we need to destroy life on Earth in order to get a certain mineral, because we might be able to get what we need without doing that.
Thank you very much, Bill. I think we are running out of time, but I wanted to conclude with one last question that we received on the chat, just really quickly, because it actually opens a window on the future. And it says that with all the all the new oil and gas discoveries in Africa, how can we reframe or renegotiate the deals between the exploration companies and the ministries of energy in each country? If you could just in a few words tell us, how do we imagine a future where there is a renegotiation in this a sense that actually tries to solve the moral dilemma that we have between fossil fuels and renewable energy sources in African countries? The floor is yours, Bill.
That's good. That's a tough question, too. But well, one thing that might be useful to focus on, many of these companies that are investing in development have claimed that they can sequester carbon dioxide. And there's a big debate about how successful they would be. But if I were an NGO in Africa, or I was an environmentalist in one of the agencies, I might pick up on that and sort of tell the companies, they said that, go with it, show us how you can do that, and build that into what you're doing. The other thing is that if the companies what they are fundamentally going to do is what they think will be profitable, so one way to get them to rethink is to just make the point that they're going to have to do some things in order to continue to get the authorization. That's kind of a superficial answer. I don't know how to really answer your question terribly effectively, but let me just say this too. Get behind renewables, get behind modular nuclear, which doesn't generate carbon, and that is probably the best way to readjust the whole system.
Thank you very much, Bill. I've honestly really enjoyed reading your paper, but I've enjoyed really even more challenging recommendations and having this conversation with you. So really thank you for sharing with us your insights, although it was very challenging to do it in such a limited amount of time. I'd like to thank you all, to our ladies and gentlemen, to our audience, for joining us here today. It has been a pleasure having Bill. It has been a pleasure receiving your dynamic questions on the chat, although we weren't able to ask them all. But I invite you to visit the Policy Center for the New South and the Atlantic Council's website to learn more about this topic of interest and to read our policy briefs, policy papers, and the different research that is published around this. Thank you very much for listening to us, for joining us, for your attention, and I hope to see you soon in a new event jointly organized by Atlantic Council and the Policy Center for the New South.